Aquarian Music Witch, the podcast.
Well, usually I just sort of jump in, but I'm really very excited to talk to you because when I came across your social media, I was really impressed with your entire background. I completely know firsthand how hard it is to get that far in academia, especially as a queer person or a person with really any kind of marginalization or especially compounding marginalized factors. But even like putting identity totally aside, you have such a depth and a breadth of areas of interest and like of study. And I thought that it was just really interesting that you're now thinking about turning to coaching. And I saw that you talk on your channel about how people sometimes consider life coaches and that kind of thing to be like a scam.
Yeah.
Um, and and let me back up to you're also Dr. Simone Kolysh, which is congratulations. That's extremely impressive too to reach that far. But I think we both recognize there are some grifters in that kind of coaching space. And I personally believe there's a lot of value to getting guidance from a responsible and educated life coach who has a philosophy that aligns with you, especially when there's more traditional forms of help are not necessarily designed or optimized for you. And I also know that, at least for me, there's a lot of imposter syndrome that comes when you're trying to set yourself and your skills up as a brand. There's like a lot of external people and things trying to make you feel less than and illegitimate and like you shouldn't even try. So I hope I'm not rambling too much, but I would really love to just hear, first of all, how you got to that point and like what kind of life experiences are setting you on that path and how you're navigating that and accomplishing the amount of amazing things that you have.
Sure. Thank you for having me. First of all, I really appreciate it. I initially was going to be a physician back when
Oh,
I was
wow.
little, and I went into a pre-medicine program at NYU, in part because as immigrant children, we are pushed into medicine, law, or business, but in part because I was really into biology, and that's what I received my bachelor's in. And at some point throughout college, I realized that healthcare isn't all it's cracked up to be. And it was particularly when I learned of intersex people. And as a biologist, it was a huge shock that I did not know of sex as a spectrum, nor of how physicians in the United States in particular approach intersex infants. And something changed that week when several intersex activists came to NYU and gave a presentation. And my life was always complicated, and I was getting married needlessly, and I was pregnant during my senior year of college, and just did not really have the passion to pursue medical school as much as when I began college. So I pursued a master's in public health instead. And I think during that program, because we learned social determinants of health and illness, my faith, whatever faith I had in the healthcare system, was further shaken because I learned about inequality. And but learning it is one thing and living it is another. And I was gaining experience as a queer person and as a pregnant person, and I came out as non-binary around then too, and just sort of realizing that there are entire populations left out of health and care. And so I thought, okay, well, let me go and work. There was a recession, and I had my second by then, and I went to work for the American Cancer Society for a few years as a patient navigator. And I not only realized that, the difference between survival and death is one's race and one's class and one's location in New York City, but I realized that I was angry at physicians and pharmaceutical companies for how they determine pricing, and that even if I was the smartest, most competent physician, that my hands would be tied by insurance and by bureaucracy. And I burnt out rather quickly trying to help, hundreds of people a week trying to get them grants. And I was pretty successful in getting folks grants to afford their cancer treatment. I think I got nearly $1 million worth in grants, but I
Wow.
couldn't understand why these grants were necessary in the first place, if people saved, their whole lives and supposedly they did everything right according to our society and would just end up destitute anywho. and and I also couldn't understand why people who are oncologists were really poorly equipped to help folks through their last days. And I kind of learned on the job to support people, and I couldn't understand why we weren't encouraging hospice care a lot more of the time either. It was really heartbreaking that we would overtreat people and do chemo and radiation and all sorts of really invasive treatments up until the last few weeks, instead of just allowing folks to come to terms with where they are and where their family member is, and just, managing pain and all of that. So, I mean, something broke in me as part of that job, and I needed to understand what's wrong with society. And I ended up doing a PhD, which in retrospect is hilarious because that certainly teaches you what's wrong with society, but I did not know that prior to, and I didn't care what it was in. Actually, I remember Googling like sociology and psychology and
Mhm.
anthropology and history. It wasn't relevant really to me, like in what I should get it, just as long as it taught me something about the world and I could teach undergraduates. I always wanted to teach, and this is going to make sense now as I move into life coaching, but I knew that I wasn't able to teach K through 12 because there are a lot of restrictions placed on teachers in middle school or high school by parents and the state. And so I wanted to teach undergraduate students thinking that there was less restriction. But again, I was not very informed. And I did end up doing a PhD in sociology. And during it, I got radicalized in terms of like my class consciousness. I was an adjunct for over 10 years. I'm back to being an adjunct now. But in any case, I realized that the people who teach our children are underpaid by and large, not counting the like white men who are tenured and who do get paid if they're in economics, for example. But I was doing a sociology PhD, and social sciences and humanities are under attack right now. And so
Absolutely.
um, that attack isn't new. It began long ago with, privatizing higher ed and adjunctification of faculty and, really mistreating graduate students. And so anyway, as I was trying to get my PhD, I was doing a lot of organizing and I was working a lot. I had my third kid. There was no parental leave at the time, and I had to teach 2 weeks after delivering him, and he was like nearly 11 pounds. And so I was teaching and I was in pain, and I was doing intro to women's studies.
Wow.
Um, and as usual, my life bled into my work, and there was no distinction I can make between what we study as, academics and what we live out as multiply marginalized people. And so along those lines, I wanted to explore being harassed on the streets of New York sort of all the time since I was 11, 12. And so did my students. And there wasn't a lot of academic attention on this. There was some activist attention on this. And so for the next 10 years, I did work on interviewing people who harass others, people who get harassed, and eventually wrote my book, Everyday Violence, the public harassment of women and LGBTQ people. And, you know, as that book was written, I shifted. I used to care about what the oppressor classes thought, like what men thought and cisgender people thought and why they did what they did. And then I really stopped caring and shifted to kind of a more of a feminist ethic, to consider the impacts of any form of oppression. And I got a concentration in LGBTQ studies and a certificate in women's gender and sexuality studies. So I would say I hid behind education, as a place of safety, but also as a very precarious place, because I could not afford to live. So once I graduated in 2019, I got a job out in Maryland, and by then you know, was pregnant again with now my wife's embryo. We were doing reciprocal IVF, and the pandemic hit. The baby was born one day. New York went into shutdown the next.
Oh no.
And 2 months after that, we were moving. And I ended up at a liberal arts college, so to speak. And it was really difficult because I was the perfect academic, great at research, great at teaching, loved service. But I, had to realize that no matter where I was teaching, the institution does not actually care to foster inclusivity and diversity and whatnot. And this actually got exacerbated because of the pandemic, because we lost so many disabled students, we lost so many disabled faculty, we were forced to teach in person at some point, and then I became a problem, quote unquote, because I wanted to remain virtual. And many professors got fired or laid off, and there were situations far worse than mine, that I can't even speak about, which showed me they don't care about us, not one single bit. And so when I eventually did go end up teaching in person, they dropped the mask mandate mid-semester and just left me high and dry, but also started this process of removal where they said, students have this kind of feedback. Of course, it was just a few students, but in any case, and they said, you're talking about Black people too much and you're spreading the lesbian agenda. And I had to sit through this ridiculous interrogation for hours where I was like, I stand by everything that I teach and I stand by what I said. But I didn't realize it was just their, initial phase of firing me. And then Roe v. Wade was overturned. And I was so angry and I was so scared, just like so many other people. And I made a few TikToks calling out conservatives as our enemies for doing this, and calling out liberals and moderates as well for their complicity. And those TikToks were used to fire me, like as the last nail in the coffin. And being fired after giving over a decade of my life to academia was like a blessing in disguise, because it left me to figure out who I am if I'm not successful based on society's ideas of success. And it took me a few years to figure that out. I'm still working on it, but eventually, when you're no longer part of that all-consuming grind for productivity, and when that voice, that endless voice of you have to publish more and do more and write more and whatever, was quieted for me, I said, okay, what do I want to do? And I was always a mentor, right, and an academic coach anyway for some years. And I said, don't even really, I don't mind helping folks through the academic grind, but I have so much more to offer. This was also when I came to understand I'm autistic, and then got diagnosed with Ehlers-Danlos and Hashimoto's and PMDD. And so, as I healed through burnout, I had to address um my disabilities that that are exacerbated by things like graduate school and being mistreated. And so I learned a lot about healthcare once again, and how no one is believed and we're gaslit all the time, and how I had to advocate for years to figure out what's going on with me and my mental health as well. And so I realized there are a lot of other people struggling in very similar ways. I was also collecting data for my second book, and the second book is on reproductive journeys of transgender and non-binary people. But as it turns out, this same population is also multiply disabled and often neurodivergent. And as I was listening to these people's stories of healthcare or lack thereof, I realized how many of us are in the same boat. Late in life diagnosed autistic or having ADHD or both, people who were gendered as girls earlier on, and we have issues with PCOS and fertility and infertility and PMDD, folks who have faced trauma, right? And so now go through PTSD, CPTSD, all sorts of nervous system dysregulation, and then people who are oppressed in society, which is, of course, connected to our health and well-being. And so I saw an autistic life coach at some point, and she changed my life. I never talked to another autistic provider in my entire life, and I've had a lot of providers, and it just was this serendipitous, event. And I thought, there are not a lot of autistic life coaches out there, or any kind of coaches who are LGBTQ, or who can combine, as talking magic with talking science, and talking activism and talking parenthood, and just not gaslighting folks about where they're at and how hard they're finding whatever that moment is to be. And so I said, let's go for it. And my wife helped me so much, because she's a techie, and she put my website together. And I've been on social media for some years, and so have, established a following on TikTok and on Twitter, and, just went to my circle of friends and acquaintances, and said, this is what I'm doing. And it's been pretty great. I still, adjunct, and teaching and it remains very important to me, teaching undergraduates. But at every school I adjunct, women's studies in particular is under attack. And so I don't know how long we can do this. And it's important to me to work virtually, and to set my own schedule, and to be in charge of my time, and to not be evaluated by people that I do not consider my peers. And I think what academia does is it infantilizes us, even though we are so credentialed and competent and smart and capable. And I don't want to feel that anymore. And when you work for yourself and clients choose you, it's a better setup for a lot of us, because no one's held captive, no one's required to be there. People want to work with you for your expertise and your skill set, and if they don't have to. And so it's a lot more adult of an interaction, I think. And beyond that, I've found this life coaching to be a very sacred experience for me, because I have gone through a lot in my life, and I believe that can help people. And then you see folks at different points on their journey, parts of which you've already traversed. And then you could also use your autistic brain to just help them with untangling, their clusterfuck of a life in a
Mhm.
sense. I hope it's okay to curse. I'm
Yes.
so sorry.
No,
Take
you're
it out.
fine. Please.
Take it out. And to use what so many consider to be a problem, to use your nervous system and your neurotype to see clearly for others has been a very sacred experience, to recognize that other people are where you used to be or where others used to be, and you know exactly how to get them from point A to point B. And so much of it is just about believing them. And I know that sounds really simple, but no one's believing us.
Mhm.
No system, no provider, no therapist, no family member. People aren't believed when folks are experiencing pain or mental anguish, or even coming to understand they're transgender or queer or whatever. And someone like me is perfectly suited to say, oh, that's wonderful. Like, that's amazing. We're going to sit here and celebrate that for a minute, and then we're going to work on getting you to a place where you can celebrate it yourself. So the idea of life coaching is obviously to work yourself out of a job and to get a person to a place where they feel confident in approaching life, navigating life on their own. And if they then need support, they can ask, but that they feel capable on their own. And unfortunately, that takes a long time because there are a lot of different issues we need to work through, and those do take years. But I work with incredible people every day, and it's just been, it's not anything I've ever imagined doing, but it's exactly what all my education and lived experience led me to be good at
Yeah.
right now.
Well, I'm so thankful actually that you're on that frontier. And I can't even express to you how parallel the story that you tell me is to mine in so many ways. And hiding in education was something that I think I also did, that a lot of us do. And then we get to that high point where we realize, oh no, like I did learn, I know what is going on here, and absolutely no one can hear it. And it's just you talk about validation, or I don't think you use the word validation, but it's so important. And even just, I guess, representation too is part of that, like hearing a story like that and just being like, yeah, we're not only are we not alone. I think this does happen to a lot of people who wake up in those ways. And I did order your first book, the Everyday Violence book, and it has not arrived in the mail yet, but I am so excited to read it actually. And I will be reading it. And I was reading the reviews, and it's just a huge deal that you've completed a work like that. I know it takes a huge amount of passion and effort to execute, and also hearing that you had 3 children on top of that. I just like amazing. But I guess I'm wondering if you've had any new insights about your audience, or based on how people have reacted to that message since the book was published.
So I don't think enough people have read it.
Mm,
I think every author feels that way. And maybe that's a good thing too, because there's so much backlash against public scholarship.
mm.
And I don't just mean intellectual, that's fine. I mean folks being harassed and doxxed and
Yes,
threatened
absolutely.
for their work. And so I haven't faced that in response to my book. I have received great feedback from undergraduates and graduate students who read it, because folks are assigning it across a variety of courses,
That's great.
that it's written accessibly. And I'm very happy to hear that, because it's what I worked very hard to achieve. And you're right, I struggled to put it all together, because when I was finishing it up, I had my infant. And so I wrote it in the first year of the pandemic, or finished it, I think, then too. And I wasn't sleeping, and I wasn't taking care of myself, but we were also so deathly afraid in New York because of how the pandemic impacted us there specifically. Um and I wouldn't recommend that process, that kind of work to anyone because I was, burnt out. And I don't understand that person anymore who wrote every night as the baby slept, because I was being driven by the wrong things,
Oh,
which was that I'll eventually need this book for tenure and it better be out first or second year I'm on the tenure track. And I need to do it now. And all of that is manufactured anxiety. It's manufactured urgency. And so now that I'm, some years out and I'm working on my second book, and by working, I'm thinking about it. I'm not actively working on it because I'm still in serious recovery from burnout, and I refuse to work on it simply because I have to. And now that I work for myself, there are no looming deadlines or tenure clocks. And I wonder how to deal with feeling that, if my pace is slower, then I'm somehow not, producing fast enough to honor the voices and the people who interviewed with me. I think that is the only factor that drives me now, is that I want to give those words space, and I want to put them on a page, and I want to tell people stories, and I best get to it, because expanding the reproductive justice agenda to incorporate transgender and non-binary people is a really timely topic. I mean, just anything regarding reproductive justice at the moment um is important, and I wanted to get that data out there, but I refuse to work on it until I feel able to. So in retrospect, I will simply write a shorter book. It is not going to be an academic piece of work as much. My editors suggested it could be written as a trade book, just for popular consumption.
sure.
And my first book is for popular consumption too. It's just that it's not being consumed as it should. Um, but this one is going to be written more from a personal perspective, taking the reader through, my own reproductive journeys, which have been many, and for it to be more vulnerable. So what I've learned is to be more vulnerable, to not have to work in a way that others deem legitimate. Like, because that initial book was my dissertation turned into a book, it had a lot of these components. I oversighted people. I think my lit review was like 50,000 pages. I don't know. And I had to create models for the book because I thought models are important. And so now all
Wait,
of that, after sloughing all of that, and coming into this business and into my own, right? Really coming into my own. Um, that vulnerability is really a double-edged sword. It opens you up to a lot more critique, and people are very ready, gleefully so, to critique everyone. But I know there are these like rumor boards where it's essentially a cesspool of all these like people who post anonymously, and they are constantly discussing those of us in the public eye and making fun of our trajectory. And so they haven't stopped talking about me for the last decade. and and it shows that what we do as trailblazers, I think, as multiply marginalized people, um, has all those other people all tied up and obsessed about our movement, our growth, and our evolution. And so, so vulnerability exposes you to claims of delegitimacy, lack of scientific rigor, all of that stuff. But I still want to give these folks who interviewed with me their time, and I'll get there. I wanted to say that when Roe v. Wade was overturned, I was no longer able to do work on this book, not just because I got fired, but because it was too difficult to talk about this topic of reproductive justice. And then at some point, maybe a year after that, as I shifted gears, I found that passion for it again, and that's when I met with my editors and a couple of other editors who are interested. There are many editors interested in this work, so that's something I want our viewers to hear, who say there is a very serious need for this kind of conversation. And so that was really encouraging for me, and gave me some energy to kind of revisit and look at my data again. But I think instead of oversighting and trying that hard, I think I'm just going to let their stories speak, and then I will respond to their stories with my own. And that's gonna have to be good enough. It's gonna be a different kind of book, but it's going to be a much more evolved, mature version. When I read my first book now, I see a different version, a younger version of me. I still think it's great, uh, but it's a version, you know? So I'm interested in what this new book is going to look like when I care a lot less about academic accolades. And I think it's going to be angrier. I think it's going to take healthcare to task the way I always should have. And the way I kind of did my whole life anyway, but now I'm prepared to really say, you harm people, and here's how.
Aquarian Music Witch, the podcast, is made possible by listeners like you. To support this project, you can contribute directly through our Ko-fi page at ko-fi.com/Aquarian Music Witch, or consider subscribing to our Supercast page. With the AMW Supercast Content Access Pass, you'll gain access to a vault of exclusive content and other cosmic perks starting at just $5 a month. Now, back to the show.
That balance of safety and visibility becomes so interesting too, because vulnerability, I totally agree with you, is a double-edged sword. And there's this weird, like when you're in academia too, and you're writing a book, there's a certain kind of book that's for academia, and you can kind of market it to the students, you can market it to other professors who might appreciate it. And a lot of academics, as you know, their first book is kind of coming out of the dissertation and is an extension of that or whatever it is. And I think a lot of us do that, kind of approach it like, let's, anxiously try to cover all of our bases and do the thing. You're never going to quite, but that's one audience, and it is like very niche. Like even a successful book in that audience is not going to be on all the shelves at Borders, or is Borders even open anymore? But another kind of book is this more like geared toward and I think that when you're in women's studies, when you're in any kind of like queer or critical theory, or any spaces like that, I think a lot of times those books, they become more reflexive, and they do kind of blur those lines and stand in the middle somewhere maybe. But I'm really excited to see something that's like more geared toward just the people. And then you've brought up Roe v. Wade a couple of times, and I want to know if there are any like specific political frameworks or policy changes that you think are particularly valuable that might help to address and like mitigate the forms of violence that you're talking about, or the reproductive issues that you're talking about. Is there anything you feel especially strongly people should be talking about more, people should be advocating for, or that you see really helps your clients?
Yeah, that's a really good question. Of course, immediately I think about Black maternal mortality rates and the medical racism embedded in especially the reproductive field here in the United States. And, Black providers, midwives, doulas, practitioners have been screaming into the void for decades. And the discrepancy has gotten only worse because of the pandemic and because of the disproportionate impact of COVID-19 and on Black and Brown people, but also on pregnant people and, and their children as a result. And so I immediately think of all the conversations involved with options, community care. Different states are involved in a variety of policy changes to try to alleviate the maternal mortality crisis for Black people. And no matter where you look, white people have Columbused it, whether it's hospitals or the midwifery field or the doula field or the home birthing field or whatever. Because what I believe fundamentally is that labor should be free and people should have options. So everyone should be informed. And if they'd like a home birth, that should be made accessible and available. If they want doulas, they should be made accessible and available. If people want a hospital birth, that one needs to be safe and accessible and available for everyone. So while everyone's fighting, people keep dying. And what we're not naming is this medical racism, but it's not like I'm the first person to say it, right? Dorothy Roberts has been talking about this since Killing the Black Body, and she's still talking about it in her newer works and whatever else. So I just keep thinking of these nurses and midwives that I interviewed that are talking about how there are these like alternative, supposedly better fields, right? But those fields of midwifery and doula-ship are also taken over by white women. And as they move towards these credentials, these national credentials, the same oppressive structures are reinforced, as we saw in the medical system when we examine it for its obstetric violence. So that's thought one. Thought two, in terms of how I'm organizing the book, and what I always thought was the connection is, climate change and climate justice, and the way that birth justice connects to climate justice in my head, the way that birthing is such a normal, natural process that has all these artificial barriers now written into it because of how society is organized, and how our environment, our physical and ecosystem is also a normal, natural process that is being killed and impacted by these artificial, creations of ours, and how when we take a look at who's most impacted by climate justice, it tends to be people who birth as well. And right now I'm thinking of what's taking place in occupied Palestine, and the way people there can't get menstrual products, can't get through a pregnancy, that pregnant people are being bulldozed over by tanks, so I recently read a collective of like Black and brown birth workers and midwives, I believe, put out a statement to connect for everyone else, the conversation between reproductive justice, climate justice, and colonialism and current colonial projects. And so that's something I don't think enough people in the reproductive justice field are understanding. The violence, embedded in colonialism is one that impacts people who birth. And the framework of patriarchy isn't enough to understand exactly how it's all connected. So we need this framework of post-colonial studies, whatever, what have you. It doesn't matter. It does not have to be academic. We just need to understand that there are connections between what's happening to our planet and what's happening to people who birth. So that's the second thing I'm thinking of right away. And of course, criminalizing, pregnancy, miscarriage, abortion. Just if you take a look at anything that's happened since Roe v. Wade was overturned, and these horrific cases of people being punished for having a miscarriage or a stillbirth or whatever. I mean, it's just completely unethical. And what constitutes a crime is, of course, a huge question. And I know I sound like a sociologist, when I say that, but obviously it's all made up, right? So it is not a crime to have a miscarriage, but it should be a crime to, impact people through policy that causes them pain and death and a criminal punishment. But that's where, we all disagree in terms of what laws should do and how they should protect people. But in fact, they end up hurting folks instead.
Sure. Yeah, well, crime is political, I think, definitely. And also, you had brought up toward the beginning, like a medical and a social model of disability. And I know there's like a big debate around that. But it is all very much like defined by, I don't even know what to say, like defined
Well,
by.
it's all defined by these institutions, by the medical industrial complex and the psychiatric industrial complex. And that's clearly been the powers that these institutions has developed. They have developed over the last century from bad to worse.
Sure. And I guess
So
colonial violence is what I want to say, really. And I think that it's right that, decolonization seems like a big factor in mitigating a lot of that. And I think there's another side to it because I think a lot of important work is being done. But yeah, this entire thing about like criminalizing pregnancy and miscarriages has been very terrifying to live through as anybody that can get pregnant. So I'm very glad that your work is focusing on that because it's such an important issue. And I want to maybe change the topic just a little bit and get a take from you about when you're talking to clients, because you've mentioned you focus on marginalized clients and helping them and validating them. And I am so particularly interested in how spirituality intersects with your life coaching methods. I'm personally very interested in kind of post-colonial spirituality and figuring out how to decolonize spirituality and what that looks like. And I'm sure you have a lot of like firsthand practical insight about that. And like how spiritual practices or beliefs help, I think, with resilience and empowerment, especially for people facing societal barriers. And that's kind of a complex conversation, but I would love to hear what you think about it.
yeah, so you know, as I came across others in the wellness and spiritual wellness field, I saw the same thing that I saw in academia, public health, or wherever else I worked, which is that white people are given more space and voice, and they, being generally misinformed about their power in society, tend to reinforce oppressive structures in the spiritual fields as well. So I found myself thinking, first of all, I believe in the spiritual as an important component of our life. I believe in the unexplained, as I said in that one video you watched. I believe in multidimensionality and people's psychic and other capacities. So all of that is real. What's artificial is the 3D framework, right, that we've got in which all of this oppression is embedded. But what's also real is that the artificial framework seeps into the spiritual framework without people deconstructing or decolonizing their ideas. And so what I find when people want to work with me practically is I have to look at the matrix of who they are and figure out where they are located. So they could be like well versed in tarot or in witchcraft, let's say, but they have not understood their social location in terms of their whiteness or their class position or their understanding of, even things like gender as a spectrum. So we can't really believe that there's this divine feminine and divine masculine as one of the laws out there, because even if everyone keeps saying this has nothing to do with gender, I just don't buy that the universe and the consciousness that's out there would really name it that. But so what we're talking about, what you're asking about, is spiritual gaslighting and spiritual bypassing, which is this notion of leaving the world behind so that you could go on an ascension and have a spiritual evolution, and refuse to confront that these social systems impact our spiritual journeys. And so when I work with a person, I kind of have to figure out, they might want some deepening of their spiritual practice, but I might have to pull them all the way back out to start grounding them in some feminism, some, intersectionality. And so that's why I'm saying that the person that I am is the right person for the now, like, because my spiritual path was always there, and I meandered often on it, but I'm glad I got the training that I did to now talk about the spiritual the way I do, so that I'm not one of those people who refuses to confront inequality, as I talk about, healing others. And then for multiply marginalized people, as you said, spirituality is so important, especially deconstructed spirituality, because it can empower them. And so that person might be really knowledgeable, whether they want to or not, about racism or sexism or homophobia, and be stuck in these, oppressive systems and structures, but they need to recognize how powerful they are.
Mhm.
And and by powerful, I don't just mean, in the 3D, but that they are divine. And so actually, for the most marginalized of clients, their immediate concerns are obviously financial, they're obviously material, they're not able to explore spirituality or their divinity because, well, they're working all the time or they're parenting all the time. And this is one of the many ways that I can see the 3D suppressing ability, in that sense, because, like, regardless of your position, every single one of us has the capacity to, like, shift dimensions and help others and do magic. But people who are oppressed don't have the space and the time and the peace and the ease and the calm to recognize it. And what's interesting is that the universe does not always care, and it'll kind of throw folks into their abilities. They'll discover they have visions, or they can see something, and they might be very scared to explore it. And so what's wonderful is that I can be like, tell me all about things you are scared to talk about. You tell me about what others would laugh about, and let's work on that. So sometimes the universe doesn't wait until you're in your most evolved place to throw you. But I think when it comes to just kind of religious paths and more institutional religion, I've really been upset lately at how women and, like, trans people and people of color and whatever have been denied the opportunity to establish their own religions and paths and even be in those positions of authority. So we could just take a look at organized religion and say that lots of people are denied, the highest ascendant positions, right, of being at the top of the church, at the front of the pew, whatever. So that's a problem. But even in more decentralized spiritual spaces, we see very similar structures, and very similar people at the top, or given voice, or given authority as healers. And that's a lot of false
Mm.
truth. So, like, there will be people. I'm endlessly fascinated by this, by the way. That's why I'm kind of meandering here too. There will be people who are channeling a being, let's say. I've talked about this on my personal TikTok a lot, and that being will say not to vaccinate
Mm.
in a pandemic. And I am a spiritual being who does not channel any being, let's say. I just get downloads, I'm claircognizant, I just know things, I see things, whatever. and it makes me wonder, if that person is in a different lifeline than me, in a different dimension where that makes sense and it doesn't to me, or if they have confirmation bias, kind of, where what they're channeling is what their beliefs are anyway, and so then they're like, oh, don't get the vaccine, this being I'm channeling is telling me the truth, and I'm telling you the truth. And so it gets very, very murky. It gets very murky because there are scammers in every field: academia, wellness, spiritual work, life coaching, the legal system, religion, politics, all of that. And we need discernment now more than ever.
I was talking about
And
discernment. That's perfect.
and yeah, go ahead.
Oh no, just I totally want to second that. Discernment is where it's at. That's
But
the
how do we, but I mean, I talk about discernment all the time with my students, and they come from all paths of life and are all kinds of ages, and we develop discernment in different ways. And sometimes it takes decades of doing something, and then all of a sudden you get a realization that it's all made up, kind of. And we spiritually awaken at different times too, like
yeah.
some of us as children and some of us in our 60s. And so so that's not anything you can control necessarily. So for a long time a person could be entirely closed off to their magic and just be like, I'm a scientist, I'm an atheist. And I think I played that for a little bit when I was a teenager, and I now have a teenager myself who's like that. And I feel like it's a developmental phase that some people go through. And so he's very adamant that none of the magical areas of life I speak about are real, and I kind of say to myself, let him have his own soul's journey, because boy, is that spiritual awakening gonna hit him when it does. And you'll be here, hopefully, or in whatever dimension, helping along, because you can't force it. So I see people go through grad school and law school and med school, and they believe in these fields and they want to be this, that, and the other, and that's fine. And I think you kind of have to, don't you? You kind of have to, because you won't believe it otherwise. It's the same thing when people want to get married and have kids, or like get married to men and have kids. I have to be like, you gotta let them have their soul's journey, because you cannot convince a person that they don't need to do that and they don't need to have kids, and how hard it is. And then you'll just be there for them after their divorce and their 3 children, and they come to realize they're autistic and their brain is on fire, and you'll say, yeah, like, I tried to tell you, but I think we all have to go through it nevertheless. Like, knowing what I know now, I don't think our path forward is to try to prevent any of this from happening to folks, because they do need to experience it. But it does feel like a train wreck sometimes, watching a train wreck, when I'm on Twitter and I'm on academic Twitter, and people are like, oh, I'm gonna go get a PhD because I'm so excited to learn about X, Y, and Z, and I'm sitting there like already having a panic attack
For them, yeah.
for them, because that is not a good reason to go get a PhD. And there are so many amazing people doing like a DIY PhD, where they're holding themselves accountable for certain learning and they're hitting certain goals, and they're not paying, and it's great. Because education, we're so privileged in this country to get access to so many resources, and so it does not have to be collegiate or through higher ed, but many people of course think it does. And so I don't know, I mentor a lot of folks who want to go into the fields we talked about, or who want to go into running their own business, or whatever the case may be. And I need to find a balance, I keep saying, and I'm finding it, of encouragement, right? And also giving them that discernment that I did not have. saying, here's what I thought it would be like, and here's what it ended up being like. Will it end up like this for you? I don't know, but it's just something I want you to be informed about. So the way I parent my children, where I say, like, here's what's happened, here's what might happen, you gotta kind of make a call, and then we'll address the consequences of your decisions. But I can't tell you what to do, even though I want to.
Mhm.
And I know what to do. It just might interfere with their development. So yeah, I've gotten to this place where I want to prevent hurt from happening to my mentees and students and clients and children, and it seems that is an important part of their life anyway, that you can't necessarily prevent it all from playing out the way it's meant to. So this really makes me think about destiny, and the way some people believe in, soul contracts, and that we signed up for this life, and for all its twists and turns, and we did so knowingly and then forgot. And I think about that all the time, because I actually also think that we're incredibly powerful in shifting our destiny too. So I used to think things are predestined and what's meant to be will be, and that's true. But to the extent that we need to wake up to our own magical abilities, I think we can actually shift things, both small and large. And the more I come into my own power, the more I talk to the universe as an equal. I used to beg things of the universe, and I used to ask things of the universe, and I used to pray things of the universe. And over the course of my life, I started to say, here's what's going to happen. Here's what I say is going to happen. Because this is me talking to me. And so the closer I now get to that all-knowing divine spark of consciousness, the more I talk to it like a peer. And during very difficult times in my life, I've told myself, my divine self, what I think should happen. So, for example, when my wife was pregnant and the pregnancy wasn't going well and the baby wasn't growing, and this was one of the most devastating moments in our life, and it was already reaching 24 weeks, which is when New York State can legally allow you a late stage abortion. I spoke to the universe and to my wife's body and to the baby inside her. And I said, here's what I said. I don't know what is meant to be, but if I have to choose between the two of you, I'll choose my wife, and we can always have another baby, and I can meet you in other dimensions. And so I'm making a decision, a tough call here to say, please keep her, let me keep her. So later, after we did the abortion and my wife's health improved drastically, it was the right thing to do and to tell the universe. And the universe gave me the child that I carried later on, who's this magical being. But when I had one of the more serious spiritual awakenings of my life, I saw the other baby in a dimension with my grandmother, who's also passed, and have continued to see her here and there, and also saw dimensions where she lived, and perhaps my wife didn't, and kind of lived through those too a little bit. And it really showed me kind of how, when there are these crossroads in life and you are the powerful being that you are, you can say, here's what I choose, and the universe will shift. It will shift that way. And then whatever the consequences of that decision will be in that dimension. And so it's like a lot of our magic is connected to pregnancy and life and death. Actually, it's at those times that you learn a lot, because that isn't really uh that is outside of this 3D framework in many ways. That is where the veil is thin, and uh after we had this child through reciprocal IVF, we had two embryos on ice, and I had a very serious discussion with the universe as well when I said, no more children for me. You gotta take these souls, take them, and I'll see them some other time. It was a really tough conversation. I always have these conversations like outside under the night sky, where I feel most expanded in my being. And it was a tough decision, but I said, let's donate to science and let's have these embryos help somebody else, figure out their life. And so those are the components of our reproductive journeys that I don't think people share enough, about, and how much of life includes pain. And so, especially in the last few months, seeing what we're seeing and experiencing through social media, what people in Palestine are facing, or the Congo or Sudan, there's a lot of grief. There's so much grief we're carrying right now that I think we're being changed by it. I think right now this pain we're seeing is changing a lot of us spiritually, but we're not, to just get back on topic, we're not really able to understand what's changing if we don't know how to talk about what's taking place, or if we don't have an understanding of, inequality in the world. So people are feeling a lot of things right now, but they need guidance, they need education, they need terminology, and so some of my clients, feel a lot. They have really powerful gifts, of Reiki and healing, right? And channeling and whatever. But what good is any of that if you don't know where Palestine is located on a map, or what social media is doing or not doing, or you have to have media literacy, right? Some kind of critical understanding of what's coming across our feeds, and propaganda, stuff like that. So I think we can all learn something, whether spiritually or in this world, and then each of our journeys is kind of figuring out how to integrate the spiritual with the social, and how to embody that integration, without leaving this world behind. So there's, in the spiritual community, a lot of talk of just like, let's leave this world behind, let's live someplace without electricity or whatever. And it's like, actually a lot of folks already do that, and it's not by choice. And this choice you're making is reflective of huge privilege, and you do need to actually name that. And this land you're taking is already stolen, and like, we need to talk about that, so there's a lot each of us can learn, and I'm just glad that the two of us are having a conversation where these topics can be combined.
Yeah, I thank you so much for sharing that. I'm so honored that you would talk to me about that. And you talk about grief and pain, and another idea that came to mind as you were talking through that was rage, that I wanted to bring up too. And I wanted to ask what you think about rage, because I know there is so much pain in the world. And I do think I agree with you. It's spiritual bypassing. It's a way to not level up, to just kind of ignore and be like, well, we're beyond it. We're all one thing. It's fine. But no. And then there's, for people that are really in it, in the mud of it, there is a rage. And I know that in some ways that rage can be a source of undeniable, incredible power and survival, resilience. It's, to me, in some ways, rage is kind of like one of those things like love and life force that is just one of those core kind of energetic flow things. But then there's also a level where I wonder if it limits us at a point, or I think that we need to process and then reintegrate all of that. I think that we need to take time to feel those things and sit in uncomfortable spaces. And rage is one of those things. We have to allow for it to exist and be what it is. But I wonder how that plays out with some of your clients, and how maybe, I don't know, how you might advise them if people get stuck in that, or if you do see it as something that can be very empowering like that.
Yeah, no, it's an excellent question. I have thought about this so much for so many years. I mean, even many of my social media handles include the word fury in it, because I always considered myself to be moved by justified and righteous rage. But this comes from my training in women's studies, especially in Black feminism, because of that initial essay that I read, called On the Uses of Anger. And it's not the same as rage, but anyway, it's related, on how white supremacy silences uh, marginalized people through respectability politics, and through forcing a set of behaviors that are sanitized, that don't permit for rage, that don't permit for riot and protest and justified grief and political response or an activist response. That's why, for example, people dismiss feminists as angry and man-hating. And I just read this article where people are like, a stereotype is that a feminist is a man-hating, angry person, but it's just a stereotype, and we should be accepting of everyone, and be kind and polite and whatever. And I was just like, no, I disagree. It's totally fine to be an angry feminist, and if you aren't enraged, you're not paying attention, and we're not going to be silenced. And it's so, first, I think that it's important for marginalized people to express their rage, because suppressing it causes illness, and it ages people faster. We could talk about minority stress and all of that from the public health perspective, but there's that concept of weathering as well, that over time, racism and experiences of it weathers on the body. It erodes the body, and we can talk about every other form of oppression doing something similar. But in the spiritual realm, in terms of embodying our rage, without becoming consumed by it, is what you're asking, without becoming it versus anything else, is an excellent question. And I consider it to be a facet of a very multifaceted being. And so whenever I see a person who hasn't yet met that version of themselves, I think that's a very important next step, is to let a person somatically, or physically, or whatever, psychologically, get angry, start screaming, start moving. I think there's a lot of, as you said, life force to it. I think it is productive. I think it is destructive. And I think that's fine. I don't consider that to be mutually exclusive or contradictory at all. It's kind of like birth, and death. It's both. It's productive and destructive. When you have a baby for the first time, the person who you were before that dies, and a mother is born, and that's not all you are, but it's the first time you are that. And labor is destructive in so many ways and productive in so many ways. So I always come back to that as a moment outside of our world in some ways. And so rage is the same to me. Like, I would say spite is a close sister of it, and spite has led me to completion, to finishing so
Mhm.
much of what I intended. Um, and people say, don't do it out of spite. And I say, do it out of spite because it is going to move you forward. And because it's a legitimate way of navigating something oppressive and difficult and traumatizing. And so let it do what it needs to do, as you said. And then when it runs its course, you will shift inevitably. So until the rage is out of your system, it has yet to teach you something, is how I talk to my clients about it.
Yeah.
Because if you're still angry, that means you're not fully communicating to whomever or whatever, or even to yourself that something's bothering you or that something hurt and upset you. So we need to try a variety of methods of giving that rage some oxygen. So I think of it as like fire, right? It's like this all-consuming kind of fire. You got to give it more. You got to make it so consuming that it ends. It has no choice because I used to suffer from severe panic attacks so bad I thought I was literally on fire and dying every time I was in one. And instead of kind of fighting them, which I've tried to do my whole life, the last few bouts of this at the beginning of this year, actually, I think I just surrendered entirely to the darkness. And when I did, I was able to shift eventually. I just never fully surrendered to that fear and that darkness, that rage, that pain. And so I think that it is not infinite and it is not unbounded. I think eventually it will shift into something else and you'll integrate it as part of your multifaceted being. Kind of like how when you first come out as bi or queer or a lesbian and it's all consuming and that's all you think about, but in eventually it's just part of who you are, and it's not so consuming. And you don't have to put the rainbows everywhere, although I still do, and I don't think there's anything wrong with that, but sometimes, that's kind of part of our development. We got to put all the rainbows everywhere first, and then eventually it's just part of who you are as a rainbow. That's kind of how I think about it. So, so the other thing as you were talking that I was thinking is how we are not allowed in the spiritual wellness space to be full of rage because it shows low vibrational frequency or whatever. And again, I must state that I don't believe that's how it works. I don't believe in the low vibrational, high vibrational frequency breakdown of the healing spaces at all. I think it's so toxic to say that if you are fully healed, you will be calm at all times and you will ascend these human emotions like anger. That is not true. Not true to me. I'll say to me personally, it is not my truth. I suppose your mileage may vary, but I think a fully healed person is an impossibility. That's first. And I think a more healed person can experience all emotions they come across and just acknowledge it, let it work through your body, as you said, and be like, wow, I'm really angry. I really feel like my head's on fire right now. Like, what is this? And, I journal as a result a lot, or I speak into a voice note, or I need a sounding board, essentially. I always need someone to hear me through. And as I hear myself talk through whatever, the rage, etc., the answers come. A revelation shows up. It's always something revealed. And so a more healed person would simply speak back to the rage, give it a dimension. Like I give it, I have a mind palace. I know that sounds so autistic and very Sherlock Holmes of me, but I have a mind palace in which all my beings chill and hang out. I have several. And so I go to the main room. There's this like giant throne in the main room of my palace. And I say, Rage, take the throne. And Rage takes the throne. Rage becomes solid in that moment. And I say, take the throne and speak or scream or do what you need to do, take the throne. And then after that spiritual, magical witchcraft work or whatever, it dissipates, you know, and sometimes other dimensions take the throne. Inner child takes the throne. Inner teenager takes the throne. Lust takes the throne, you know, insecurity, whatever. I give them space to do that, to reign for a little bit, but it cannot reign supreme because nothing can. You know, like change is the only constant, right? So like it's a very democratic process, I guess, very socialist up in my mind balance where, you know, you could take the throne but not forever. And you spoke of integration last, and I think there are certain pains and certain griefs that cannot be resolved in this lifetime. I think the pain is so severe, the trauma so bad that it'll define the rest of your life. And of course people can do a lot with the rest of their life, but there are certain unspeakable tragedies, unspeakable human experiences that I think are very, very difficult to overcome given the world as it is right now. Not enough healers out there, not enough, you know, support community. Um, so so I think of it as this like extension into the universe that in this lifetime they experience this, and then in other lifetimes they will heal it. Or in other lifetimes as we experience them now, that healing may or may not take place. I think there are certain things I can feel them, but I do not fully understand them, that are not for us to understand, that may take many lifetimes to work out. And I struggle a lot with the concept I mentioned before of how it was all agreed to beforehand, that a soul would come in and, you know, I don't know, live until it's 1 years old, I guess, after getting all its limbs blown off. I have to sit there and be like, was that on purpose? Because that's what people ask me. People struggle with this idea of it being predetermined and agreed to and then forgotten, and what's it all for? And I think that's a really important question where people ask a spiritual question, but it's more of a life question too. But you know, and they say, how could it be? What's it all for? How could those souls be here for that purpose? And to experience that much pain. And even if they're gone now and they're passed on, the people who survived them experience so much pain. Is that their, you know, part of their mission? And it must be. But I talk to the universe, you know, as a peer, and I say, you know, some of this feels insurmountable. The grief and the pain. I can't imagine what it feels like, and I don't want to imagine it. And I'm pretty angry. And then I say, and what does that matter? Because I'm privileged and safe for now, and I just don't understand what lessons we're supposed to learn from it. Because honestly, I've experienced a ton of trauma in my own life, that is connected to, you know, children being hurt and whatnot. And I've seen a lot of atrocious images over the past few months. And personally, I don't need any more of death and despair in order to learn whatever I'm supposed to learn from this. But I'm questioning the universe here and there for meaning. And I realize that's a very old human quest, right? Because throughout all our lives, and grief and pain and war and despair, so many must have questioned and asked God and the universe why? So that must be part of our incessant questioning and journey or whatever. But honestly, when my clients ask what is the meaning and what is the purpose of this grief and pain, I do not think I have a lot of answers, and I don't think I'm supposed to, but I just think that right now people are at a crossroads in many ways
Yeah.
that pertains to our faith, hope, spiritual work, magic, at a crossroads for why keep going. I mean, I feel like that's a relevant question. A lot of clients ask, because folks have anxiety and depression and mental illness and just are struggling. And so I never shy away from questions like that. And I don't simply say you need therapy and medication. I think that people do need therapy and do need medication, but it's okay to ask those questions of each other. It's how we connect as human beings. And perhaps the lesson in all of this is to connect better, more authentically, without lying to ourselves and each other. Sorry, I'm a huge mess. I am not sorry. I will not apologize for feeling intensely through this
Thank you
conversation.
for feeling intensely. This is every word of this I'm hanging on. I'm so thankful for your presence. You're brilliant and a shining light.
Thank you. So are you.
Thank you. Well, I have a lot to reflect on myself after this conversation, and I really appreciate you so much. I think this might be a good place to stop, but this has really been such a gift. It really
Yeah.
has. So Dr. Simone Kolysh, I hope I'm saying that right.
Yeah.
Dr. Simone Kolysh, this book, your book is Everyday Violence, the Public Harassment of Women and LGBTQ People, and we'll look forward to your forthcoming book as well. I'm so thankful for your time today.
And if anyone needs me, you can find me at defiantlifecoaching.com.
Yeah, we'll put that all in
To working with any and all of you. And
yeah.
thank you for listening to this wonderful podcast.